Thank you so much, Laureen, for the invitation to be part of this series. I'm honored to be here with you and Shari today. Trauma has become an area of fascination for me. It wasn't a starting point, and I wasn't moving here intentionally, but I landed here because I'm a Montessori educator. I've been a Montessorian for almost 30 years. I worked in the private sector, and I worked mostly with adolescents. And in 2013, I moved to Cleveland, Ohio, and I did the thing people say never to do. I did 3 major life changes all at once. I moved from Atlanta, Georgia to Cleveland, Ohio. I moved from teaching to administration, and I moved from private sector to public sector. And I had the privilege of being the founding principal at Stonebrook Montessori, which is a public Montessori program, and found myself working with a population of children for whom trauma was pervasive in a community. It was a largely African American community, high needs community, and we very quickly learned about trauma. We learned that we didn't know and didn't understand our community. And having been a longtime Montessorian, Montessori to me it's an empowering, it's liberating pedagogy. It's broad and open, and is very much grounded in needs, in meeting the needs of the developing child, not stuffing a curriculum into them, but meeting them where they are and aiding them in their development. And so, working with a population that had very unique needs, ones I hadn't experienced before, and ones that there wasn't a curriculum guide for. So in that process, a colleague and I in Cleveland, a colleague came upon peace literacy and introduced me to Shari and Paul. I'll let Shari introduce herself. But the combination of peace literacy skills and the awareness that brings to human behaviors and the conditions for human growth and flourishing and learning created a beautiful synergy. And, well, Shari, I'll let you go from there before we get too far into what it is we want to talk about today.
Thank you, Jacqui. It's an honor to be here, and it was such an honor and a privilege to be working with you and your colleagues in Cleveland in the public Montessori setting. So as Jacqui said, I'm Shari Clough, and I'm the curriculum coordinator for the Peace Literacy Institute. My day job, I split my work between working as a professor of philosophy at Oregon State University, and I also have a lab called Phronesis Lab, and Phronesis is Greek for practical wisdom, and the idea isn't that wisdom isn't something you have, it's something you do in the world. And so, there's probably better or worse ways to do it, and we ought to have a lab that experiments with that. So that's how we've been working in our philosophy lab, with sort of an unusual pairing. And I came to peace literacy late in life, just after the 2016 presidential election in the U.S., where I'm speaking here from Corvallis, Oregon. I'm originally from Canada. I just become a U.S. citizen, and the 2016 election was my first election. And I've been working on social justice issues as they appear in science policy or don't appear in science policy. And peace is always kind of there. Peace and justice, of course, but I didn't have any. I mean, who's against peace? I was yay for peace, but I had no real sense of what it might look like or how we might achieve it. And so then when Paul Chappell came to talk about peace as a literacy, I was really became critically aware that I did not have a robust peace skill set toolbox. And that I had a couple of tools, a couple of skills, to use those metaphors, that I had been bringing to my social justice work in science policy. And they were primarily moral outrage and sarcasm. Those were the two. And leading up to the 2016 election, I kind of had run those out to that. I had done everything with moral outrage and sarcasm that I could do. I mean, and I don't mean to sell myself short as a philosopher. I had clear conceptual whatever. But but the idea that the piece that I had thought of as a goal, it was very worthy to think about it, not so much just as a goal, but as a skill set. And that there were some skills around peace that were actually getting in the way of my social justice work was huge. And so I reoriented my research and teaching at Oregon State University around peace literacy, and then began at the same time to work with Paul full-time. So I have a couple of full-time jobs. And it was through that got to meet Jacqui and work with folks who were using our curriculum like on the ground, especially with young people, young folks. I had been using it in my university classes and had been working with some folks to teach it in high school, but it was really great to see Jacqui implement these ideas with the very young. So it was a really pretty steep, another steep learning curve, and I'm very appreciative of being included in that journey, Jacqui. Thank you.
As I listen to you talk, that reminds me of sort of where my head was when I met you and when I came to the work. And I forgot to say earlier that I still work in Cleveland. I'm no longer the principal at a school. I now work for the district as the director of Montessori programming. And so now I have a bigger view. But when I first needed peace literacy as a skill set, it was interesting because I had learned most of my peace literacy skills from working with adolescents in a Montessori context. So I had more than sarcasm and moral outrage at my disposal because I had been working with young people in the context of a Montessori environment to help them process their sarcasm and moral outrage, and had landed in some things, dabbled in some things, right? And then when I learned about peace literacy, it was like, you ever had one of those moments where you're kind of doing something and then somebody gives you a framework for it and you go, oh yeah, that. And so it just resonated and clarified for me some of the things that I had been learning through what adolescents were teaching me.
Oh, I love that. I love that. I have had fantasies of being a high school teacher over the last 25 years of being a philosophy professor. But I also worried that I'd be in the principal's office too often.
Well, and in my experience, I was the principal, and the kids that came to my office were the ones who taught me the most, actually, right? And so and then the need for peace literacy. With younger age groups in Montessori, we have something called grace and courtesy. I mean, it goes all the way through, but it's really heightened with primary and elementary children. But it applies also to peace skills in that, grace is your sense of self and moving with grace and managing yourself and self-regulating essentially. And then courtesy is how you interact with others. And I find that peace is, for the children who were coming to the principal's office, who I was getting to work with, they were grappling with peace within themselves and also being peaceful in their interactions with others. Those kids who were in my office were the kids whose needs weren't being met, right? And so, Montessori is a pedagogy. It's a way of learning that is based on human needs, right? And again, it's what do children need at different stages of their development? And then we strive to create a learning environment that meets those needs. The whole method of education shifts to meet children's needs. And we were very confident, right, in that our school, we were building on that. We had a pedagogy that was sound, and yet there were children who were not engaging fully in the learning environment. They were getting into inner altercations with their classmates. They were resisting lessons. They were not engaging in the work. They were getting into all kinds of trouble, and they were landing in my office, right? And so it was an interesting place then to question, well, then what does this child need? If I believe I've created an environment that meets their needs, and yet it's not serving them well, then I must be solving the wrong problem, right? I must be addressing the wrong need, or I've overlooked a need, or I don't know the needs fully. And so as a staff moving into the professional development space to really learn about trauma and the impact of trauma, that's how we came to needing greater peace literacy skills, both for the staff and for the children, right? Not just like we thought it was for the children. And as we got into it, we realized, wait, we've got some needs here too, because there were impacts on the children, right? The children were experiencing things. We were experiencing things in our work with them that we didn't anticipate. So there were new needs that came to light, and therefore we had to develop other skills to be able to meet those needs. And so then that's where your work provided some of those answers. As we were learning about trauma, as we were understanding the physiology, right, what happens to the brain and the development of the children, again, especially young children who are experiencing trauma in their lives, whether it's acute trauma or generational trauma or any number of other things impacting children of color experiencing poverty in an urban environment. There were just layers. There were layers and layers. So we learned about ACEs. We learned about the neurology of trauma and all of those things. And even those studies left us with, okay, so we know this. And then what do we do about it? And how do we frame it? How do we serve, right? How do we fulfill the needs so that they can move on to the learning and the healing? So it would be great if you would say some more about those needs and the peace literacy skills that go with them.
When someone is acting out, let's say acting aggressively, however you define aggression, rather than responding to that aggression, checking in and recognizing that aggression is a response to distress of some kind. So this is a key peace literacy insight. And so rather than meeting them at their aggression, maybe responding back with aggression, whether it be passive aggression or social aggression or physical aggression of some kind, how might we check into what kind of distress they're in? And often that distress comes from an unmet need or an attempt to meet the need unskillfully, or not even recognizing that they have the need, let alone how to meet it. And so if there's going to be a take-home lesson from this conversation that we can come back to, it'll be recognizing when, the very young and adults in your life come at you in ways that seem hot and aggressive, that is a signal. And it's a signal of something else that we all, you don't have to have ESP and, read their minds, but there's usually you have quite a bit of information about what kind of distress they're in. And if you've built sort of a trusting environment with them, with a bit of conversation, it doesn't take much to discover, in fact, what kind of distress they're in. Often the distress they're in comes from an unmet need. And we really work on kind of overturning the presentation that Maslow gave us. And he's got belonging somewhere near the top, but recognizing that things like belonging, purpose and meaning, nurturing relationships, explanations. I hadn't thought of that as a need, but there's lots of data. Of course, 2-year-olds are asking questions. Why? Because they're building their worldview. They're seeking explanations for how the world works. Inspiration, self-worth, challenge, transcendence. All of these needs I never learned that I had them, or the couple of times where I knew that belonging was a thing, but it had only been presented to me in terms of a negative, like peer pressure. So if you needed to belong, then, really, you need to be individual. Think for yourself. What if everyone jumped off a cliff? Would you jump off a cliff? No, I just want to go out with my friends tonight. What? So from a very early age, that need was seen as a weakness, and it meant that I didn't learn to take it seriously as a driver of my behavior, and I didn't learn how to meet it healthfully. Anyway, so these needs that I'm just learning about, it was so powerful to see Jacqui articulate how she sees those needs coming, showing themselves in the very young, and how when they get tangled with trauma, Paul K. Chappell, who really put this peace literacy framework together, also articulated some pretty predictable patterns of emotional tangles of trauma, he calls it, that come out of these needs either not being met, or when traumatic experiences can get tangled in our attempts to meet them. Our need for purpose and meaning can get tangled in trauma and result in meaninglessness. Our need for nurturing relationships can get tangled up in trauma and produce terrible mistrust. And Jacqui sort of looked at this list and then came up with this beautiful set of practical guidelines for, okay, if you have a child in your office who's presenting with alienation or shame or helplessness or mistrust, and they won't use those words, and sometimes they do, but you can, depending on their age, give them those words. But you can also sort of plumb through and filter through what they're doing and kind of do a reverse engineering to then, well, what need does that indicate might not be being met for them? And rather than seeing that as a weakness in them, the brilliant thing that about Jacqui and Montessori here is like, well, no, actually our job is to meet those needs. I think also it's important to realize that kids who don't present with like with aggressive responses, or they can look like they've got these needs met, but really they're adapting to, and this was Jacqui's insight as well, it might just be that they've learned how to adapt, suppress certain needs, or dismiss certain needs, which they can get by with for a few years until it catches up with them. But it might just be that they've learned to adapt to a pretty crappy environment. And so it's not only our job to meet their needs, but to help create, and this is Montessori's brilliant insight, create environments where those needs get met reliably. So it just hits all of these problems of trauma at the root. ACEs scores are great to have. What's leading to that?
I love that, Shari. What's leading to that? And really for us, it was, what does that look like every day, right? How does that show up in that 7-year-old body every day? And your work really helped us you talk about the needs and then the tangles of trauma. Well, what we were seeing, it helped us frame the behaviors we were seeing and then work to untangle the trauma, to be able to find and meet the original need, right? Not to address the behavior, like you said earlier, not to try to find solutions, because there's all sorts of programs out there for how you treat the symptoms, but for us to be able to say, this child's daily rage, right? That kindergartner who walks in every day angry. And we were hearing ourselves say things like the adults. We were so, I worked with an incredible staff, and we were so tuned into these children and cared so much about them that we'd listen to ourselves. And when we would say to each other, he's 5, he walks in every day angry at all of us. We didn't do anything to him. Where's this anger coming from? And to ask that as a genuine question, and then to begin to say, all right, this anger, right, that rage is a tangle of trauma. What's the unmet need? And then to strive to meet the need as a way to heal the response, right? It just became this wonderful dance. And so having that clarity, the connection of the need and how it can get tangled, this is what we see. How do we get back here? Knowing that if you nurture it and feed it, the behavior will take care of itself, rather than spending all our time over here trying to deal with the behavior. And what that presents, what that affords, is such a humane way to interact, right? It allows for such dignity and such love and acceptance that healing can happen. And if healing is needed, no learning is going to happen. So if healing can happen, then learning can happen. And then there can be real connections and, and all it just goes on, right? To the kinds of conditions we want to be able to live in and have children experience and have adults experience too. So that is, and then that comes back to the peace, right? So you all do a lot of work around trauma and understanding trauma, and how is trauma then connected to peace? And it's what I said earlier, we can't be at peace with ourselves if our needs aren't met. Right? We will be struggling to get our needs met or struggling to cope with unmet needs and can't be at peace. And if you can't be at peace with yourself, you're hard pressed to be peaceful with others. Right? And as we're, you and I talk every now and then, Shari, about how I love your slogan, the world needs more peace literacy, right? It's not just for children, but man, if we could get started with children we heal as we grow, right, as time goes. But adults need this work and this skill set to be able to do all of that internal and personal work, such that we can be different with one another and with this planet we live on. There's so many layers, so many layers.
There's ways in which focusing on behavior and rewarding positive behaviors is such a huge improvement over a variety of other kinds of behavior management sort of things that have been going on in US schools for the last 50 years. But just focusing on the behavior and its management also sort of forecloses this rich, humane work. And I think now, to be sure, to do that rich, humane work takes skill. And if we aren't giving teachers the tools to do that work, then just focusing on the behavior might be better than deciding that, Johnny is a rotten kid. Saying, oh, Johnny is acting out today is better than saying Johnny is a rotten kid. But looking at the acting out and just looking at the acting out, thinking that you're just looking at the acting out, and now returning to the equity issue of this conversation, how does that acting out look in the body of a little black boy versus the body of a little white girl? You're going to notice those behaviors and read them very differently. And so this positive behavioral interventions and supports program that was put in place to kind of be more neutral and objective, if it's put in place in a racist system, then it's just going to reproduce those same inequities.
There's so much to be said around that, right? The inequities and our own biases. And I think all educators experience that, right? What we have as a paradigm for what students do at school is that they sit quietly and they listen and they do what they're told and they repeat or not, and number one, Montessori already is way messier than that, right? Kids are moving around, they're choosing their work, they're developing independence. And so there's much less control. So I think what came to mind as you were talking about the equities and our perceptions and whatnot, a piece of that is power structures, right? And typically in schools, teachers, adults have the power, children have none, right? So Montessori is already in a space where we strive to focus on power with instead of power over, right? Children have choice. They're able to work out problems. They're able to ask for what they need. They're able to get up and meet their own needs, right? Go to the bathroom if you need to, get a drink of water, have a snack, sharpen your pencil, right? Without having to ask for permission. So there are systems, right? Routines and rituals within classrooms that are different than the norm. And then to take it another step further, right? And thinking about how do we empower young people to express their needs. So some of the 9 non-physical needs that are identified in peace literacy are key to a power dynamic. So one of my favorites is explanation, right? Old school is you do something because I said so, or you do something because it's a rule, right? In Montessori, we're always explaining to kids, right? Primary children, their question is what? So we work to give them the names and the nomenclature for everything. Elementary children, their primary question is why? And we're constantly talking and giving explanations and telling stories and inviting their thoughts. And what do you think is an explanation for this? So the space of inquiry, right? That space of the adults aren't the ones with all the power that have all the answers. And yet they can provide answers. And when children ask authentic questions, to provide answers and explanations. And sometimes the answer is, I don't know, let's find out. Or I don't know, what do you think? And what do you think? And oh, we have different explanations. And oh, people in this culture explain things this way. You read various creation stories and you say, well, which one's true? Well, they're all different and people all have their own way of explaining things. Okay, so there's a playfulness even around meeting some of these needs and embracing those needs as just part of what we do. And they ultimately impact a power dynamic too. I'm not the one who has all the answers and tells you everything, but I invite you into this process, and I give you the authority and the control, and the meeting needs gives you what you need to empower you, right? Such that you have and develop your own power. So I don't know if that was articulate enough, but it loops in the power dynamic as well, which is connected to peace, right? If I am being oppressed or dominated, then I can't be my best self, and I'm not at peace, right? But when I can, and I am empowered, and I am a participant in my learning and my living, then I can experience more peace. I want to loop back to something, Shari. You had spoken earlier about discipline and connected to equity. Discipline. We're doing a number of things wrong with education. We're under-educating children, and we're over-disciplining them because school tends to be about compliance rather than about learning. That idea of discipline and punishment, right, for not showing up in the ways that when all of our needs are met, we can show up in we're pretty stellar people. Like I really like humanity most of the time. And yet when our needs are not met, it's harder to show up in those ways. And so if then we're not showing up in those ways, let's say we are being aggressive or we are being cynical, then punishment for that, does that increase the trauma and increase the challenge? Or, right, because there's a belief that discipline and punishment specifically is needed to get compliance around behavior. Is that the most successful way to get behavior? Is it the most compassionate way? Is it the most effective way? And what we're suggesting in our work, in our collaborative work, is that it's not, and that instead of disciplining behaviors that aren't showing up as your best self, that instead of disciplining those behaviors, if you look for the unmet need, meet the need, then the behavior changes. Like, that's a significantly different place to put your attention. And when you look at the correlation of who are the people who most often don't show up according to the dominant culture's narrative of what is acceptable behavior, right? That's where the equity conversation is amplified. And so this need for putting aside the discipline and the punishment, serving and supporting and meeting the need, right? So I'm proposing that as another takeaway, right? We, instead of disciplining behaviors, seek the unmet need, meet the need, and watch the behavior dissipate.
Next time an adult in your life, or you, or a young person, is exhibiting less than ideal behavior, aggressive behavior in response to a conflict. Conflicts happen all the time, but if they're responding that way, you're responding that way. Checking in, if you can, to the distress underneath that aggression, you'll get way better results. It's a better way to connect with the person, and it's a more skillful way. Once you check into the distress, that's the fires, as we say, beneath the aggression's like the heat. If you can check into that fire, just dealing with the heat, you need to put out that fire as well as you can. And you won't do that unless you check in and recognize it and think about it. And that's where peace literacy has just a much broader tool set is then opened up for you if you're looking at stress as opposed to looking at the aggression. So that's sort of one thing I would leave people with.
And I think I'm going to say the same thing, probably, Shari, because I totally agree with you. I think that's the essence of what's possible here, is to look beyond the behavior to the need. Even just small things to start to get to where we talk more about what's real for us, what's really going on. What do I need? What did your response just make me feel? Or how did your response just not land right with me? And so I think about being humble and being vulnerable and being much more present to one another. right? Like really stopping to ask, something came at you in a way that I didn't like that. I didn't like what you just said, and I feel some kind of way about that. Just take a moment and say, I wonder where that was coming from. Just to ask more questions about one another rather than assuming our motivations or assuming our capacities or assuming anything. Just to be humble in each other's presence and ask more questions about what's really going on. Just feels like relaxing a little bit in the way that we are together, so that then we can use our new skill set to come up with different results.
So thank you for the prompt to look at this chart a little more with a little more care. Looking on the right-hand side, these tangles of trauma. And I should say Paul has his research is laid out on this beautifully in an essay available for free download on the website. But I can just go over an outline here from this chart. When you see a child presenting with like meaninglessness, where they cannot make meaning of their lives. And of course, this will show up in different ways depending on their age. That might be an indication that their need for purpose and meaning hasn't been met, or that their need for purpose and meaning is tangled up in a traumatic experience that needs to be untangled. When you see a child routinely coming mistrustful into a situation, your spider senses might tingle, and that really what's going on for them is some kind of traumatic experience is tangled up with their need for nurturing relationships. When you see a child come in with a ruthless worldview and completely disillusioned, and this is very similar also to numbness and cynicism, we're seeing this younger and younger kids coming with this. Their need for explanations, has it been cut off? Is it not being met in a healthful way? Has there been some kind of traumatic experience that's getting them to make their need meet their need for explanations with inaccurate explanations that fuel a ruthless worldview? Rage, if a child is rage filled. I mean, we talked about how in general, when you see people behaving aggressively and yourself feeling aggressive, that's often a response to distress, and the distress can often be a response to an unmet need or a need not being met skillfully. Rage is like an exaggerated version of that. And interestingly, in Paul's research, he ties, and a lot of this is from his own autobiography, he ties that tangle of trauma, that emotional experience of rage, to his need for expression not being met. And so then the cynicism and numbness might be an indication that the child does not have their need for inspiration met. And kids need inspiring role models. That's almost a cliche now, but by virtue of being a cliche does not make it any less true. When they're behaving in a way that indicates alienation, their need for belonging needs attention. If they come to your office with shame and self-loathing, and they in this shame spiral, their need for self-worth, their sense of self-worth is just out of whack. Typically, yeah. So, if they, and penultimately here on the list, if they're behaving helpless, like nothing they do matters, nothing they do makes any difference, have we been setting challenges for them that are beyond their skill set or too low? And it just feels like, they're being, patronized, that can lead to a feeling of helplessness. And finally, if you see them engaging in addictive behaviors, and of course, this is a subjective, what counts as someone who runs every day, 5 miles every day, is that an addiction? Maybe, some kinds of addictive behavior are healthier than others, but if part of what's going on is the addiction is getting in the way of healthful flourishing, whatever that behavior is, it might mean that the child is, or the adult is unable to take time, to transcend time, to put time on pause. I had not thought about this as an important need in myself, but and this explains in really profound ways why so many children love video games. You can press pause. You can press rewind. Your character dies. They don't give up. Like, if they can't solve a math problem, they suck at math, right? Their character dies in a video game. they start over and play again. Like what is it going on there that is meeting their need for transcendence? And they can stop time, they can manipulate time, they can step out of time, they can have this moment of, as adults, we might meet that need by taking a walk and appreciating the urban landscape or the forest landscape and just sort of being out of time briefly. We all have that need. And if we're not able to meet it, that can show up in this, addictive behavior is often a way to control time and to step out of time and to have all of these worries just be put on pause for the love of God.
I do wish for a pause button so often in my days. And I'm learning to take it, right? So, Shari, thank you for that. You explained each of those from the perspective of those children that I've talked about coming into my office. And it did, right? Those things showed up in so many different ways. And children are remarkably clear and honest in being willing to say to you what is going on with them if you are only willing to listen. But as I listen to you talking about it, I just see that list as a list of the things that are ailing our society right now on a societal level. I mean, it's not just, children from particular experiences in their lives experiencing trauma. There is generational trauma. There is systemic trauma. There is societal trauma. We're living these things together, right? This, meaninglessness, a ruthless worldview. Wow. Rage, alienation, addiction, shame, helplessness. These are things that are plaguing so many people in so many ways. And to be able to see those things and their prevalent expression and have a framework that gives us a way to understand and strive toward community healing, large scale, addressing needs not just on an individual level with that compassionate dignity that we talked about at the beginning, but also on a larger scale for how do we address these needs in our society and in the systems and structures of our society. That's a huge takeaway for me today. Thank you.
The most dangerous weapons of war in the 21st century, as Paul Chappell reminds us, are not bullets and bombs, but the weaponization of these tangles of trauma. What is going to get us in the 21st century and what we already see, the devastating impacts of the weaponization of mistrust and cynicism and rage and alienation and shame. And this is the way in which social media is playing a role here. This is no longer between nation states, although certainly we know that different nation states are manipulating social media in ways that, if someone wants to destroy the United States, they could drop a bomb, but they could also use social media to ramp up mistrust, rage, alienation, shame, and helplessness. There's a lot of research going on this right now. And so we need folks to understand that this is going on, understand that they have these needs, understand that something like living through a global pandemic in the inequitable situations we are is traumatizing. And we are all of us going to be responding in just these ways. And it's going to take us apart. Here's the sense in which peace literacy is survival literacy. Here's the sense in which knowing about our non-physical needs ties into world peace. Pretty straightforwardly. Thank you. Yeah.